Welcome to The Austrian Case for the Free Market Process, a presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute. The Austrian Case for the Free Market Process was written by William H. Peterson and narrated by Louis Rukeyser. The quotations are read by Dan Church, Pat Childs, Mike Edwards, Marshall Falwell, Jim Gossett, Travis Hardison, Paul Meyer, and John Scherberg. This recording of the Austrian Case for the Free Market Process was produced in 1988 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.
To many people, the name of Ludwig von Mises is not familiar. Like many great thinkers throughout history, Mises lived in an age when popular attention and conventional wisdom did not include his reasoning and his point of view. But like other intellectuals or artists who followed their consciences in a hostile world, Ludwig von Mises and his followers have had a profound impact on economic thinking in the 20th century. Mises is recognized as the founder of the modern Austrian school of economic thought. He followed in the footsteps of his forebears at the University of Vienna, Karl Menger and Eugen von Bombewerk, and he built on the work of these early Austrian thinkers. Yet Mises was to flee Europe in 1940 in order to escape Hitler's armies. He was to struggle against the prevailing wisdom in a world where collectivism and big government were thriving. In Europe, Asia, and America. He was a rather lonely advocate of freedom in a rather unfree world. Mises lived a long life, yet he received little recognition during that lifetime for his intellectual achievements. But Mises' influence is very evident in the achievements of his students. One of these students, Friedrich Hayek, won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. Two of his other students, Fritz Machlup and Gottfried Haberler, each became president of the American Economic Association. That association honored Mises in 1969 by naming him Distinguished Fellow and emphasized his prodigious writings in the award citation given in 1969.
It would not be possible to enumerate the ideas which Mises has originated and disseminated over the years, but some of the most fruitful may be mentioned. In monetary theory, the application of marginal utility theory to the explanation of the demand for money. In business cycle theory, a demonstration that a monetary policy stabilizing certain price indices would not at the same time stabilize business activity. In the theory of socialist economic planning, the discovery that the type of economic calculation required for an efficient allocation of resources cannot be carried out without a system of competitive market prices. The recent movements toward decentralized planning in several Soviet-type economies add the endorsement of history to the insights at which Mises arrived almost 50 years ago.
Ludwig von Mises was born in 1881 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire city of Lemberg, now ironically the city of Lvov in the Soviet Union. Mises' father was a construction engineer employed by the Austrian railroads. Mises grew up and was educated in Vienna. Entering the University of Vienna in 1900, Mises received its degree of Doctor of Jurisprudence in 1906. At the university, he studied under Friedrich von Wieser and Eugen von Bombewerk. His teachers were followers of Karl Menger, who had founded the Austrian School of Subjective Economics approximately 35 years earlier. Soon after his graduation, Mises served in World War I as a captain of the artillery in the Austro-Hungarian army on the Russian front. In the early 1920s, Mises earned international recognition for an article and a book called Socialism. In this work, he spelled out the inherent problem in socialist economies of what he called economic calculation. This is the conundrum of how viable relative price relationships and capital investments can be determined when socialism wipes out capital markets. Between the two world wars, Mises formed a private seminar in Vienna that was to make waves. Gottfried Haberler wrote a description of the seminar in 1981, more than 50 years after it began.
In the early 1920s, during my student days, I attended Mises' seminar at the University of Vienna before I was invited to the private seminar. The university seminar was a teaching seminar, but it was on a high level. There were student papers, and Mises himself lectured on many occasions. The seminar was sharply focused on economics, mostly on one of Mises' specialties, the theory of money and credit in particular. The private seminar, on the other hand, ranged more widely beyond economics into sociology and philosophy of science. It was a postgraduate affair, a high-level discussion group. Practically all participants had a doctorate, and many were lecturers in the University of Vienna or visiting professors from foreign countries.
Participants in the seminar included many who would make names for themselves in later life or who already had become well known. All of this intellectual activity is surprising in view of the foreboding events in Europe, and especially in Austria. Haberler recalls these conditions.
The period between the two wars, from 1918 to the occupation by Hitler, was for Austria, and especially for Vienna, a sad epoch, from both the political and economic standpoints. One calamity followed the other. Collapse of the old Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the traditional frame of the new Austria. War exhaustion and destruction. Hyperinflation and incomplete recovery, followed by deep depression. Civil strife on two fronts, and then the dark night of Nazi rule, ending again in war, destruction, and four-power occupation.
Still, in this period, Mises was to meet the woman who was to become his wife, a dedicated woman who, after Mises' death in 1973, also would become quite an exponent and publicist of his philosophy. Indeed, a renaissance of Austrian economics began in the mid-1970s, and it can be argued that this was in part traceable to the efforts of Mrs. Mises to promote her husband's work. Margit Mises wrote her memoirs, entitled My Years with Ludwig von Mises, in 1976. In this book, she describes how she, a widow with 2 children, met Mises at a dinner party in 1925.
There were 6 guests that evening. One of them was Ludwig von Mises, a 44-year-old professor of economics. He sat next to me, and the conversation was mostly about economics. I did not add much to the discussion. How could I? He offered to take me home, but on the way he proposed to go to a bar opposite my house to have a drink and dance. He did not dance well, so I preferred to sit and talk with him. The next day, when my host told me that he was considered to be the greatest living mind in Austria, it gave me quite a shock. He seemed so unpretentious and simple, so easy to talk to. That day he sent me a wonderful assortment of red roses, called me soon afterwards, and asked me to have dinner with him.
13 years were to pass before the two would be married in 1938. Meanwhile, in 1934, Mises accepted an offer from William Rappard and Paul Montreux to join the faculty of the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. Mises proposed marriage at Christmas 1937 in Vienna, and the wedding was set for April 1938 in Geneva. The timing of Mises' marriage was fortuitous. In March 1938, 1 month before the planned wedding, Hitler ordered German troops into Austria. Margit Mises describes her last days in Vienna.
One day, when I walked along the Graben, one of the most elegant streets in Vienna, I saw how young people had climbed atop a big high monument to watch the Jews washing the streets. Whenever a German soldier or officer passed, the poor Jews had to step into the gutter, accompanied by the howling, roaring laughter of the crowd. In St. Stephen's Cathedral, a huge picture of Hitler was hung. On March 14th, Hitler marched into Vienna, the city where he had lived as a pauper in a flophouse, painting and selling postcards. That night, he made his first speech over the radio. His voice still rings in my ears. It was rough, throaty, and vulgar, but it had an almost unbearable strength, combined with a hypnotic power of persuasion.
On March 26th, just 12 days later, Margit and Gita, her daughter from a previous marriage, boarded the train for Switzerland. But this was only after securing with great difficulty permission from the Nazi authorities to leave Austria.
But the excitement was not over. Police officers, Gestapo agents, SS men, one after the other, came into the compartment of our railway coach to inspect our passports and examine our documents. Only when the train moved out of the station and gathered speed could I breathe easy. We were free.
In April 1938, as planned, Mises married Margit Sereni Hertzfeld in Geneva on the very eve of World War II. He was 57 years old. Little more than 2 years later, after Hitler had taken Paris, German troops fanned into central and southern France. The Mises valiantly set out by bus from Geneva for the Spanish border, and their object was to get to the U.S. The bus trip began by coincidence on the anniversary of America's Independence Day, July 4th, 1940. The trip was hazardous, as Margit Mises describes.
To get there without encountering the Germans, the driver had to change his route frequently after seeking information from French peasants and soldiers. We had to make a great circle, going via Grenoble and Nyon to Orange, which was to be our stop for the night. The German troops had advanced very far, and they were everywhere. More than once, our driver had to backtrack to escape them.
Nonetheless, the Mises family managed to cross into Spain and Portugal. They sailed for the United States and arrived in New York Harbor in August 1940. Henry Hazlitt, a journalist and an author in economics who was to become a close friend of Mises, picks up the story at this point. 2 years before Mises arrived in New York, Hazlitt had written a favorable review of an English translation of Mises' book, Theory of Money and Credit. Hazlitt had called this work a classic in our time. He had sent a clipping of the review to Mises in Geneva, and this had led to some correspondence. Hazlitt describes his first personal encounter with Mises.
One day in 1940, the telephone rang, and when I picked up the receiver, a voice at the other end said, "This is Mises speaking." As I later told some of my friends, I could hardly have been more surprised if the voice had said something like, "This is John Stuart Mill speaking." I had called Mises a classic, and a classic does not ring you up on the telephone.
1940 was a most trying year for Mises, as it was for the free world. The Battle of Britain began that fall, and Hitler soon occupied most of Western and Central Europe. In a somber mood, Mises wrote at that time that totalitarianism was rampant, and that if capitalism collapsed, it would be caused by the acts of men, not by any inevitable historical development.
If the return to capitalism is really out of the question, as is maintained by socialists and communists, then the fate of our civilization is sealed. But I have demonstrated that the doctrine of inevitability of socialism and interventionism is untenable. Capitalism does not destroy itself. Men wish to abolish it because they expect greater benefits from socialism or interventionism.
Mises conceded that in 1940, at the age of 59, his already considerable efforts at persuasion had borne little fruit. He believed that maybe the world was not ready for freedom and free enterprise.
Occasionally I entertained the hope that my writings would bear practical fruit and show the way for policy. Constantly I have been looking for evidence of a change in ideology, but I have never allowed myself to be deceived. I have come to realize that my theories explain the degeneration of a great civilization. They do not prevent it. I set out to be a reformer, but only became the historian of decline.
As he had done in Vienna, Mises soon launched his seminar at the New York University Business School. William H. Peterson, who was a student of Mises beginning in 1950, and who later became his NYU faculty colleague, recalls Mises' personal demeanor.
I remember Mises the man, and very much the individual. I remember his poise, his bearing, his European graciousness, his world view of things, his tremendous command of history and philosophy. I remember his kindliness and understanding to graduate students, even when they put inane questions to him. One such question in the 1960s followed his discussion of the inflationary implications of deficit finance. He was then asked why President Lyndon Johnson couldn't have both guns and butter. "But he can have both," replied Mises, adding with a twinkle in his eye, "if he's willing to pay for them."
Lawrence Moss, a student of Mises who later became an economist at the University of Virginia and Babson College, tells of his own intellectual transformation at the famous Mises seminar.
I read his books and questioned those aspects of his thought with which I disagreed. Oddly enough, the more I argued against some of his tenets, the more he seemed to appreciate my presence. I slowly began to understand what Mises' philosophy is essentially about. It is more than a theory of economics, and more than a program for political activity. It is a philosophy built around the individual considering his opinions and decisions to be important. Mises' laissez-faire is more than a plea for economic sanity. It is a plea for human toleration.
William Rappard, who had invited Mises in 1934 to accept a professorship in Geneva, has recalled the courage and integrity of Mises. Rappard describes an incident during a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Seelisburg, Switzerland, in 1953.
Mises expressed concerns that some of the Mont Pelerin Society members themselves were becoming inadvertently infected by the virus of interventionism, state ownership of transport, social insurance, minimum wages, counter-cyclical fiscal policy, etc. "But what would you do?" a member asked him, "if you were in the position of our French colleague Jacques Rueff, who was present at the meeting and at the time responsible for the fiscal administration of Monaco? Suppose there were widespread unemployment and hence famine and revolutionary discontent in the Principality. Would you advise the government to limit its activities to police action for the maintenance of order and the protection of private property?" Mises stood fast. He replied, "If the policies of non-intervention prevailed, free trade, freely fluctuating wage rates, no form of social insurance, etc., there would be no acute unemployment. Private charity would suffice to prevent the absolute destitution of the very restricted hardcore of unemployables."
Mises held his seminars at New York University for many years, and he defended his principles until the end of his life. Mises' last years have been partly recounted by Lawrence Moss.
Mises' last public address was given in New York City in May 1970, on the topic to which he devoted more than 50 years of thought: socialism versus the free market. He died in October 1973 at the age of 92. He was survived by his wife, Margit, his two stepchildren, Gita Sereny Honeyman and Guido Sereny, his personal friends and confidants, Henry Hazlitt and Lawrence Fertig, and a host of students and admirers the world over. His personal library of 6,000 volumes is housed at Hillsdale College in Michigan.
The Old Testament says the love of money is the root of all evil. Somewhat facetiously, economist Milton Friedman has said that in economics, money is the root of all evil. More than 3/4 of a century ago, Mises was saying pretty much the same thing in his first major work, The Theory of Money and Credit. This work was first published in 1912. In the English-language edition of the work published 4 decades later, Mises commented on the evils of inflation and fiat paper money.
40 years have passed since the first German-language edition. In the course of these 4 decades, the world has gone through many disasters and catastrophes. The policies that brought about these unfortunate events have also affected the nation's currency systems. Sound money gave way to progressively depreciating fiat money. All countries are today vexed by the gloomy prospect of a complete breakdown of their currencies.
Mises wrote of this concern for the value of paper money in 1953. Since that time, all the currencies of the world have been further battered by inflation. Gold, which sold then at the official price of $35 an ounce, has since soared to more than 10 times that level in world markets. In the U.S., the Consumer Price Index quadrupled from the 1950s to the 1980s. In New York City in 1948, a subway ride cost a nickel. In the 1980s, $1. The U.S. government imposed wage and price controls in 1971 in an attempt to arrest inflation. They were abandoned in 1974 as a failure. In 1979 and 1980, the U.S. Consumer Price Index hit double-digit levels. Mises not only predicted a breakdown of paper currencies, but he explained why it would occur.
There is need to realize the fact that the present state of the world, and especially the present state of monetary affairs, are the necessary consequences of the application of the doctrines that have got hold of the minds of our contemporaries. The great inflations of our age are not acts of God. They are man-made, or, to say it bluntly, government-made. They are offshoots of doctrines that ascribe to governments the magic power of creating wealth out of nothing and making people happy by raising the national income.
How then did Mises suggest we could get from here to there, that is, from inflation to non-inflation?
One of the main tasks of economics is to explode the basic inflationary fallacy that confused the thinking of authors and statesmen from the days of John Law down to those of Lord Keynes. There cannot be any question of monetary reconstruction and economic recovery as long as such fables as that of the blessings of expansionism form an integral part of official doctrine and guide the economic policies of the nations.
But Mises says there will always be an obstacle to removing government from monetary affairs and establishing a sound currency. This obstacle is the demagogue, who does not wish to hear of the consequences of inflation. The demagogue observes that interest rates are too high and that incomes are too low. He concludes that the moneylenders are avaricious. If money is tight, he suggests that the government print more of it. Professor Mises commented on the demagogue.
He chooses inflation and credit expansion, although he knows that the boom they create is short-lived and must inevitably end in a slump. He may even boast of his neglect of the long-run effects.
Here Mises plays on a line from John Maynard Keynes to paraphrase the outlook of the demagogue.
In the long run, we are all dead. It is only the short run that counts. But the question is, how long will the short run last? We have outlived the short run and have now to face the long-run consequences that political parties have refused to take into account.
Mises also saw a refusal to face up to the long-run consequences in the government's behavior during the great economic boom of the 1920s. In 1934, Mises criticized government credit expansion as the root of the Great Depression.
The remarkable thing in the present situation is not the fact that we have just passed through a period of credit expansion that has been followed by a period of depression, but the way in which governments have been and are reacting to these circumstances. The universal endeavor has been made, in the midst of the general fall of prices, to ward off the fall in money wages, and to employ public resources on the one hand to bolster up undertakings that would otherwise have succumbed to the crisis, and, on the other hand, to give an artificial stimulus to economic life by public works schemes.
Establishing public works schemes in a time of unemployment is based on conventional thinking. But Mises was no conventional thinker, and he criticized these public works programs.
This has had the consequence of eliminating just those forces which in previous times of depression have eventually effected the adjustment of prices and wages to the existing circumstances, and so paved the way for recovery. The unwelcome truth has been ignored that stabilization of wages must mean increasing unemployment, and the perpetuation of the disproportion between prices and costs, and between output and sales, which is the symptom of a crisis.
Even in 1940, when World War II was underway in Europe and war orders were pouring into America, the U.S. unemployment rate still was 14.9%. In 1941, the year of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was rearming rapidly, yet unemployment was still 9.9%. In the view of many economists, the New Deal did not relieve the Depression, but exacerbated and prolonged it. Mises complains that a prolonged depression suggests a lack of economic understanding, especially of money, of inflation, and of their repercussions.
When governments do not feel strong enough to procure, by taxation or borrowing, the resources to meet what they regard as irreducible expenditure, or, alternatively, so to restrict their expenditure that they are able to make do with the revenue that they have, recourse on their part to the issue of inconvertible notes and a consequent fall in the value of money is something that has occurred more than once in European and American history.
So Mises comes out, not surprisingly, for what he considered honest money, for the gold standard.
Gold is not an ideal basis for a monetary system. Like all human creations, the gold standard is not free from shortcomings. But in the existing circumstances, there is no other way of emancipating the monetary system from the changing influences of party politics and government interference.
Money, in other words, should not be an instrument of public policy. Mises said it should not be manipulated by government to smooth the ups and downs of the business cycle, nor should it be manipulated to put the jobless back to work.
Money is nothing but a medium of exchange, and it completely fulfills its function when the exchange of goods and services is carried on more easily with its help than would be possible by means of barter. Attempts to carry out economic reforms from the monetary side can never amount to but an artificial stimulation of economic activity by an expansion of the circulation. And this, as must constantly be emphasized, must necessarily lead to crisis and depression.
Today, proponents of what is called expansion of the circulation usually put forth their case in terms of complex mathematical theory, much of it Keynesian theory. But Mises rejects such theory.
Production goods derive their value from that of their products. Not so money. For no increase in the welfare of the members of a society can result from the availability of an additional quantity of money. The laws which govern the value of money are different from those which govern the value of production goods, and from those which govern the consumption goods. All that these have in common is their general underlying principle, the fundamental economic law of value.
Mises' reference to the economic law of value gets to the idea that value is subjective, and that it is governed by scarcity. Mises also cautions us against confusing economic activity with monetary activity.
All the processes of our economic life appear in a monetary guise, and those who do not see beneath the surface of things are only aware of monetary phenomena and remain unconscious of deeper relationships. Money is regarded as the cause of theft and murder, of deception and betrayal. Money is blamed when the prostitute sells her body, and when the bribed judge perverts the law. It is money against which the moralist declaims when he wishes to oppose excessive materialism. Significantly enough, avarice is called the love of money, and all evil is attributed to it.
In 1922, there appeared another milestone book by Mises, entitled Socialism. This was a devastating attack on the ownership of the tools of production by the state. State ownership, argues Mises, contradicts the socialist claim that their political system maintains freedom of thought.
Freedom of the press is illusory. When the government owns and operates all paper mills, printing offices, and publishing houses, and ultimately decides what is to be printed and what not. The right of assembly is vain if the government owns all assembly halls and determines for what purpose they shall be used. And so it is with all other liberties.
Mises invokes the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky to clinch the point.
In one of his lucid moments, Trotsky, of course Trotsky the hunted exile, not the ruthless commander of the Red Army, saw things realistically and declared, "In a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, has been replaced by a new one. Who does not obey shall not eat. This confession settles the issue."
If state ownership breeds obedience, businessmen and entrepreneurs should surely be expected to fight socialism, since they have so much to lose. But Mises suggests that their actual response is surprisingly different.
Entrepreneurs have an interest in combining to proceed uniformly in wage negotiations with the workers organized in trade unions. And they have an interest in combining to carry through tariff and other restrictions which conflict with the essence and principle of liberalism, or to resist government interference which may injure them. But they have absolutely no special interest in fighting socialism and socialization as such. The whole purpose of the entrepreneur is to adjust himself to the economic contingencies of any moment.
Mises' use of the word liberalism differs in meaning from that understood in modern America. His is the 19th century European meaning of liberation from state control. In other words, liberalism means freedom and free enterprise. As Mises commented in 1922,
"Even in England, the home of liberalism, a nation which has grown rich and great through its liberal policy, people no longer know what liberalism really means. The English liberals of today are more or less moderate socialists."
Liberalism, the philosophy of freedom and free enterprise, had made much headway under classical economics. This had occurred in only 100 years, from roughly the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. Many believed that liberalism had triumphed.
It seemed that the ideal of socialism has been disposed of. Science had demonstrated its worthlessness by means of strict logic. Its supporters were unable to produce a single effective counter-argument.
What happened to England, and indeed to Western Europe, to promote socialist thought and action? In a word, Marx. Karl Marx, with the help of Friedrich Engels, mounted a masterful attack on liberalism. Mises identifies how Marxist philosophy attacked on three intellectual fronts.
First, Marxism denied that logic is universally valid for all mankind and for all ages. Thought, it stated, was determined by the class of the thinkers, was, in fact, an ideological superstructure of their class interests. The type of reasoning which had refuted the socialist idea was revealed as bourgeois reasoning, an apology for capitalism. Secondly, it laid down that the dialectical development led of necessity to socialism, that the aim and end of all history was the socialization of the means of production by the expropriation of the expropriators, the negation of negation. Finally, it was ruled that no one should be allowed to put forward, as the utopians had done, any definite proposals for the construction of the socialist promised land. Since the coming of socialism was inevitable, science would best renounce all attempts to determine its future.
With all this, Mises' most effective assault on the intellectual edifice of socialism was his concept of economic calculation. Even prominent socialists have conceded that this is a concept, a problem, that must be dealt with. Mises starts his analysis of the problem of calculation with a discussion of reason and the individual.
All rational action is economic. All economic activity is rational action. All rational action is, in the first place, individual action. Only the individual thinks. Only the individual reasons. Only the individual acts.
With these important premises put forth, Mises proceeds to clarify what he means by economic calculation.
All human action, so far as it is rational, appears as the exchange of one condition for another. Men apply economic goods and personal time and labor in the direction which, under the given circumstances, promises the highest degree of satisfaction, and they forego the satisfaction of lesser needs so as to satisfy the more urgent needs. This is the essence of economic activity, the carrying out of acts of exchange.
In an exchange economy, Mises reminds us, the objective exchange value of commodities, one with the other, becomes the unit of calculation. Through the higgling of the market, a universal good or medium of exchange is chosen, such as money. But money is not a perfect medium. It does not precisely measure the value of anything, but rather only approximates that value. Different people place different subjective valuations on any single item, including money.
Money calculations have their limits. Money is neither a yardstick of value nor of prices. Money does not measure value.
Even so, money calculation does all that we are entitled to ask of it.
It provides a guide amid the bewildering throng of economic possibilities. It enables us to extend judgments of value which apply directly only to consumption goods, or at best to production goods of the lowest order, to all goods of the higher orders. Without it, all production by lengthy and roundabout processes would be so many steps in the dark.
This point on roundabout processes and on the so-called higher and lower orders of goods is important. Mises and the Austrian school view production in stages. It begins with the lowest order of goods, which includes consumption goods such as food, clothing, and shelter, and extends to the higher stages of production goods, such as mills, mines, and mining equipment. Mises, like Adam Smith before him, notes that the more extensive markets become, the longer and more roundabout become the stages of production. As an example, let's say that a consumer wants an automobile and orders one. This type of consumer market demand triggers indirect and roundabout production demands of all sorts: steel, glass, copper, rubber, carpeting, and so on. But steel in turn demands alloying elements like chrome, vanadium, and manganese. Chrome originates mainly in far-off places like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the Soviet Union. Chrome production requires, among other things, blasting material and shipping facilities. In other words, still higher stages of production. Now, what knits together this vast network of roundabout production is the price system. Prices are a means of economic calculation, and they adapt scarce means of production through relative prices, through flexible prices, and through open markets. But open markets are incompatible with socialism, because socialist economies use what may be called in-kind payments, rather than money.
To suppose that a socialist community could substitute calculations in kind for calculations in terms of money is an illusion. In a community that does not practice exchange, calculations in kind can never cover more than consumption goods. They break down completely where goods of higher orders are concerned. Once society abandons free pricing of production goods, rational production becomes impossible. Every step that leads away from private ownership of the means of production and the use of money is a step away from rational economic activity.
Mises is emphatic that economic calculation is a necessary part of economic activity.
Without calculation, economic activity is impossible, since under socialism, economic calculation is impossible. Under socialism, there can be no economic activity in our sense of the word.
Implications of this situation are far-reaching.
If the most advanced countries do not adopt communism and fare rather well under capitalism, if communism is limited to a country which Marx considered as backward and does not bring about riches for all, is not perhaps the correct interpretation that communism is a feature of backward countries and results in general poverty?
Mises also points out that economic backwardness affects Soviet foreign policy.
This is the real crisis of Russian Marxism. Every day that passes without bringing the world revolution aggravates it. The Soviets must conquer the world, or else they are menaced in their own country by a defecting of the intelligentsia.
But what of the intelligentsia here in the West? Mises tells us that the intelligentsia are not the only ones obligated to debate economic issues. Every individual is drawn into the intellectual battle.
Everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others. And no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone, in his own interests, must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle. The decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us.
One striking aspect of socialism is that it requires bureaucratic management. This helps explain why Ludwig von Mises felt compelled to write a short but penetrating book entitled Bureaucracy that was published in 1944. In the introduction to this book, Mises makes a simple yet powerful distinction.
There are two methods for the conduct of affairs within the frame of human society, that is, peaceful cooperation among men. One is bureaucratic management, the other is profit management.
Bureaucratic management is not as simple as it may appear to some. Indeed, even Russia's Lenin sounds simplistic as he is quoted and interpreted by Mises.
The examination of these issues provides the insight required for an adequate appraisal of the two systems of society's economic organization, the market economy and socialism. It discloses the meaning of Lenin's program to organize the whole national economy like the postal system, to make the whole of society one office and one factory, and to transform all citizens into hired employees of the state.
Recall that Mises is writing this book on bureaucracy during World War II, a time of trauma and sacrifice, a time of militarism and vast government controls. The public was confused over how to organize the post-war future.
Today, millions are fascinated by the plan to transform the whole world into a bureau, to make everybody a bureaucrat, and to wipe out any private initiative. The paradise of the future is visualized as an all-embracing bureaucratic apparatus, the most powerful reform movement that history has ever known. The first ideological trend not limited to a section of mankind only, but sported by people of all races, nations, religions, and civilizations, aims at all-round bureaucratization. The post office is the model for the construction of the New Jerusalem. The post office clerk is the prototype of future man. Streams of blood have been shed for the realization of this ideal.
Mises says that we should not surrender to this idea, and that we should realize the power of the human intellect and public opinion. Public opinion had confronted the Prussian state in the first half of the 19th century, and Mises tells us that this public opinion had boldly confronted bureaucratic arrogance.
On January 15, 1838, the Prussian Minister of the Interior, G.A.R. von Rochow, declared in reply to a petition of citizens of a Prussian city, "It is not seemly for a subject to apply the yardstick of his wretched intellect to the acts of the chief of the state, and to arrogate to himself, in haughty insolence, a public judgment about their fairness." This was in the days in which German liberalism challenged absolutism, and public opinion vehemently resented this piece of overbearing bureaucratic pretension.
Although Mises' books entitled Socialism and Bureaucracy are two of his important works, his masterpiece is widely considered to be the book entitled Human Action. This book was first published in 1949, and a third revised edition was published in 1963. This 900-page volume spans the entire sweep of the human condition, as we may infer from its title. In a sense, Human Action is an uplifting book, pointing up the potential of human reason, and hence of Western civilization. It is also a serious book, for Mises was a serious man. His seriousness is clear in a well-known anecdote about Mises. When someone once remarked that Mises was not very good at tennis, he replied, "The fate of the ball does not interest me very much." Mises uses an unusual word, praxeology to refer to this broad idea of a theory of human action. Praxeology is the science of studying human choices, and it includes what Mises calls catalactics, that is, economic exchanges.
Out of the political economy of the classical school emerges the general theory of human action, praxeology. The economic or catalactic problems are embedded in a more general science, and can no longer be severed from this connection. No treatment of economic problems proper can avoid starting from acts of choice. Economics becomes a part, although the hitherto best elaborated part, of a more universal science, praxeology.
When man acts, no matter what he does, he exchanges one set of affairs for another, hopefully a better set. Catalactics also involves interpersonal exchanges of goods and services, and hence it helps account for the social order, especially in market societies. Catalactics reflects choices, for Mises reminds us that choosing determines all human decisions. He also reminds us that human activities are purposeful.
Human action is purposeful behavior, or we may say, action is will put into operation and transformed into an agency, is aiming at ends and goals, is the ego's meaningful response to stimuli and to the conditions of its environment, is a person's conscious adjustment to the state of the universe that determines his life.
Mises also distinguishes between conscious and unconscious behavior.
Conscious or purposeful behavior is in sharp contrast to unconscious behavior. That is, the reflexes and the involuntary responses of the body's cells and nerves to stimuli. People are sometimes prepared to believe that the boundaries between conscious behavior and the involuntary reaction of the forces operating within man's body are more or less indefinite. This is correct, only as far as it is sometimes not easy to establish whether concrete behavior is to be considered voluntary or involuntary. But the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness is nonetheless sharp and can be clearly determined.
Mises emphasizes that conscious behavior involves the ego or acting man.
The unconscious behavior of the bodily organs and cells is, for the acting ego, no less a datum than any other fact of the external world. Acting man must take into account all that goes on within his own body as well as other data, for example, the weather or the attitudes of his neighbors.
So we see that human behavior reflects choices or preferences, and it includes action. An action has a dual function. It selects one thing and denies another. Mises continues.
Action is not simply giving preference. Man also shows preference in situations in which things and events are unavoidable or are believed to be so. Thus, a man may prefer sunshine to rain, and may wish that the sun would dispel the clouds. He who only wishes and hopes does not interfere actively with the course of events, and with the shaping of his own destiny. But acting man chooses, determines, and tries to reach an end. Of two things, both of which he cannot have together, he selects one and gives up the other. Action, therefore, always involves both taking and renunciation.
Mises tells us that man thinks, he reasons, and he acts. It is reason that separates us from the lower animals.
Man is capable of subduing his instincts, emotions, and impulses. He can rationalize his behavior. He renounces the satisfaction of a burning impulse in order to satisfy other desires. He is not a puppet of his appetites. A man does not ravish every female that stirs his senses. He does not devour every piece of food that entices him. He does not knock down every fellow he would like to kill. He arranges his wishes and desires into a scale. He chooses. In short, he acts. What distinguishes man from beasts is precisely that he adjusts his behavior deliberately.
What also distinguishes man is that he is intensely social. This aspect of man raises the question, what is society? Mises answers,
Society is concerted action, cooperation. It is the outcome of conscious and purposeful behavior. This does not mean that individuals have concluded contracts by virtue of which they have founded human society. The actions which have brought about social cooperation and daily bring it about anew do not aim at anything else than cooperation with others for the attainment of definite singular ends. Society is division of labor and combination of labor. In his capacity as an acting animal, man becomes a social animal.
Even so, many intellectuals conceive of society as a thinking, organic entity, saying, society believes this, or society thinks that. Mises disagrees with this point of view.
It is always the individual who thinks. Society does not think any more than it eats or drinks. The evolution of human reasoning from the naive thinking of primitive man to the more subtle thinking of modern science took place within society. However, thinking itself is always an achievement of individuals. There is joint action, but no joint thinking.
Many intellectuals also confuse the role of government in society. Mises does not share the confusion.
An anarchistic society would be exposed to the mercy of every individual. Society cannot exist if the majority is not ready to hinder, by the application or threat of violent action, minorities from destroying the social order. This power is vested in the state or government. State or government is the social apparatus of compulsion and coercion. It has the monopoly of violent action. The state is essentially an institution for the preservation of peaceful interhuman relations.
Nonetheless, perceptions of the state and of democracy have become distorted by collectivism in its many guises. In other words, by the idea that economic production and distribution should be under collective control rather than individual control.
The modern revival of the idea of collectivism, the main cause of all the agonies and disasters of our day, has succeeded so thoroughly that it has brought into oblivion the essential ideas of liberal social philosophy. Today, even many of those favoring democratic institutions ignore these ideas. The arguments they bring forward for the justification of freedom and democracy are tainted with collectivist errors.
Mises says that many people see majority rule, or the doctrine of one person, one vote, as a paramount goal, and they overlook the concept of limited government.
In their eyes, majorities are always right, simply because they have the power to crush any opposition. Majority rule is the dictatorial rule of the most numerous party, and the ruling majority is not bound to restrain itself in the exercise of its power and in the conduct of political affairs. As soon as a faction has succeeded in winning the support of the majority of citizens and thereby attained control of the government machine, It is free to deny to the minority all those democratic rights by means of which it itself has previously carried on its own struggle for supremacy.
Mises' viewpoint is similar to that of Thomas Paine, who called government a necessary evil. However, Mises doesn't completely agree with Paine. He argues that while government is necessary, it is not necessarily evil. Like Paine, Mises clearly sees the need for limited government and a market economy.
Government means always coercion and compulsion, and is, by necessity, the opposite of liberty. Government is a guarantor of liberty, and is compatible with liberty only if its range is adequately restricted to the preservation of what is called economic freedom. Where there is no market economy, the best intentioned provisions of constitutions and laws remain a dead letter.
So the irony of the modern emphasis on democracy is that its principle of majority rule is often ignored, or worse, assaulted, in the marketplace. Here, every day is election day. Every candidate runs scared, and every consumer, young or old, daily has a vote. Indeed, every consumer has quite a few votes. Mises asserts that consumers are sovereign, the true bosses, in a market economy.
The consumers patronize those shops in which they can buy what they want at the cheapest price. Their buying and their abstention from buying decide who should own and run the plants and the farms. They make poor people rich and rich people poor. They determine precisely what should be produced, in what quality, and in what quantities. They are merciless bosses, full of whims and fancies, changeable and unpredictable. For them, nothing counts other than their own satisfaction. They do not care a whit for past merit and vested interest.
This line of reasoning suggests that the rich, including the so-called super-rich, are at the mercy of the consumers, including even poor consumers. Indeed, Mises turns this reasoning on its head and calls wealth a social liability.
Ownership of the means of production is not a privilege, but a social liability. Capitalists and landowners are compelled to employ their property for the best possible satisfaction of the consumers. If they are slow and inept in the performance of their duties, they are penalized by losses. If they do not learn the lesson and do not reform their conduct of affairs, they lose their wealth.
Still, despite all this discussion of entrepreneurs, capitalists, producers, owners, and consumers, Mises cautions against thinking in an us versus them dichotomy. Mises shows that producers are also consumers, and consumers are also producers, even if at times they wear different hats.
While flamboyantly repeating the truism that the only aim of production is to provide ample supplies for consumption, people emphasize with no less eloquence that the industrious producer should be protected against the idle consumer. However, producers and consumers are identical. Production and consumption are different stages in acting. Catalactics embodies these differences in speaking of producers and consumers. But in reality, they are the same people.
Mises goes on to say that government interventionists and their intellectual allies generally try to adopt policies that favor producers, defending these policies on the ground that they produce growth, prosperity, and jobs.
All varieties of the producer's policy are advocated on the ground of their alleged ability to raise a party member's standard of living. Protectionism and economic self-sufficiency, labor union pressure and compulsion, labor legislation, minimum wage rates, public spending, credit expansion, subsidies, and other makeshifts are always recommended by their advocates as the most suitable or the only means to increase the real income of the people for whose votes they canvass. Every contemporary statesman or politician invariably tells his voters, "My program will make you as affluent as conditions may permit, while my adversary's program will bring you want and misery." What is wrong with these producers' policies is their faulty economics.
Even though interventionists often favor producers' policies, Mises reminds us that the producers themselves are not ready for sainthood. They often seek unfair advantages, such as legal protection granted by government. Recall what Mises said about interventionist-minded entrepreneurs in his book called Socialism. They have no special interest in fighting socialism, and they simply adjust themselves to the economic contingencies of any moment. Of course, Mises believes that all humans are fallible, including producers and entrepreneurs. Still, Mises regards the entrepreneur as the central actor in the market system.
The driving force of the market process is provided neither by the consumers nor by the owners of the means of production, land, capital goods, and labor, but by the promoting and speculating entrepreneurs. These are people intent upon profiting by taking advantage of differences in prices. Quicker of apprehension and farther sighted than other men, they look around for sources of profit. They buy where and when they deem prices too low, and they sell where and when they deem prices too high. They approach the owners of the factors of production, and their competition sends the prices of these factors up to the limit corresponding to their anticipation of the future prices of the products. They approach the consumers, and their competition forces prices of consumers' goods down to the point at which the whole supply can be sold. Profit-seeking speculation is the driving force of the market as it is the driving force of production.
The system of entrepreneurship is variously called free enterprise, private property, market society, capitalism, commerce and industry, or the business order. This system stands directly opposed to socialism. But some social critics have insisted that both free enterprise and socialism are extreme forms of economic organization. They reason that a compromise of moderate government intervention is best. Mises calls this the German or Hindenburg view of relations between government and business. Marquis Childs called this approach the middle way in a book on government welfare programs and interventionism in Sweden, published in 1936. Childs argued the middle or third way takes the best of both worlds of socialism and capitalism. But Mises strongly disagrees, because in this system, government does not limit itself to prosecuting violence and fraud. It issues direct orders and prohibitions.
The system of the hampered market economy, or interventionism, aims at preserving the dualism of the distinct spheres of government activities on the one hand and economic freedom under the market system on the other hand. What characterizes it as such is the fact that a government does not limit its activities to the preservation of private ownership of the means of production and its protection against violent or fraudulent encroachments. The government interferes with the operation of business by means of orders and prohibitions.
Mises tells us it is not enough just to reassert an appeal for limited government.
The problem of interventionism is not a problem of the correct delimitation of the natural, just, and proper tasks of state and government. The issue is, how does a system of interventionism work? Can it realize those ends which people, in resorting to it, want to attain?
Mises says that if it is up to government to decide when it will intervene in the market, then there is no check on the government's power. Interventionism breeds interventionism, and unless it is arrested, the end result is either socialism or its stepbrother, fascism.
Champions of interventionism fail to realize that their program thus implies the establishment of full government supremacy in all government matters, and ultimately brings about a state of affairs that does not differ from what is called the German or Hindenburg pattern of socialism. If it is in the jurisdiction of the government to decide whether or not definite conditions of the economy justify its intervention, no sphere of operation is left to the market. Then it is no longer the consumers who ultimately determine what should be produced, in what quantity, of what quality, by whom, where, and how, but it is the government. Thus, the doctrine and the practice of interventionism ultimately tend to abandon what originally distinguished them from outright socialism, and to adopt entirely the principles of totalitarian all-round planning.
Planning is a slippery word in our times. An important question is, who plans for whom? In discussing this question, Mises insists that laissez-faire, a phrase that is denigrated by most intellectuals, is not mindless automatism in an impersonal market process. It is individual planning and calculation carried out in the way each person judges to be best.
The alternative is not plan or no plan. The question is who's planning. Should every member of society plan for himself, or should a benevolent government alone plan for them all? The issue is not automatism versus conscious action. It is autonomous action of each individual versus the exclusive action of the government. It is freedom versus government omnipotence. Laissez-faire does not mean let soulless mechanical forces operate. It means let each individual choose how he wants to cooperate in the social division of labor. Let the consumers determine what the entrepreneurs should produce. Planning means let the government alone choose and enforce its rulings by the apparatus of coercion and compulsion.
Of course, many people believe that government should interfere with any type of excessive or dangerous consumption. What of opium and morphine, apart from nicotine and alcohol? One remembers America's failed noble experiment of prohibition, when alcoholic beverages were banned in the U.S. during the 1920s and early 30s. Mises replies with another of his simple yet powerful observations.
Opium and morphine are certainly dangerous habit-forming drugs. But once the principle is admitted that it is the duty of government to protect the individual against his own foolishness, no serious objections can be advanced against further encroachments. A good case could be made out in favor of the prohibition of alcohol and nicotine. And why limit the government's benevolent providence to the protection of the individual's body only? Is not the harm a man can inflict on his mind and soul even more disastrous than bodily evils? Why not prevent him from reading bad books and seeing bad plays, from looking at bad paintings and statues, and from hearing bad music? The mischief done by bad ideologies surely is much more pernicious, both for the individual and for the whole society, than that done by narcotic drugs.
Mises tells us in his book Human Action that interventionism has a boomerang effect. A government that intervenes into peaceful private activity tends to make things worse rather than better. Let us assume, for example, that the city fathers feel that the price of milk is too high. They believe that infants need more milk, and that the price of milk must therefore be cut substantially by imposing a maximum price. Mises observes that the effect of such a law will be directly contrary to that intended.
Such interference produces results contrary to its purpose. It makes conditions worse, not better, from the point of view of the government and those backing its interference. Before the government interfered, the goods concerned were, in the eyes of the government, too dear. As a result of the maximum price, their supply dwindles or disappears altogether. The government interfered because it considered these commodities especially vital, necessary, indispensable. But its action curtailed the supply available. It is therefore, from the viewpoint of the government, absurd and nonsensical.
Interventionists often justify their proposals by suggesting that the rich should be taxed to pay for a new project. But Mises comments that this thinking has created absurd results. Government spending no longer is designed to fit available resources. Now revenue policies must attempt to keep up with expenses.
From day to day, it becomes more obvious that large-scale additions to the amount of public expenditures cannot be financed by soaking the rich, but that the burden must be carried by the masses. The traditional tax policy of the age of interventionism, its glorified devices of progressive taxation and lavish spending, have been carried to a point at which their absurdity can no longer be concealed. The notorious principle that whereas private expenditures depend on the size of income available, public revenues must be regulated according to expenditures refutes itself.
Mises is telling us, in a way, that there is no free lunch. Now he applies this rule to trade unions. He describes the accepted view of labor strikes, as well as his distinctly different view.
Popular doctrine contends that wage earners are reaping social gains at the expense of the unearned income of the exploiting classes. Strikers, it is said, do not strike against the consumers but against management. There is no reason to raise the prices of products when labor costs are increased. The difference must be borne by employers. But when more and more of the share of the entrepreneurs and capitalists is absorbed by taxes, higher wage rates, and other social gains of employees, and by price ceilings, nothing remains for such a buffer function. Then it is evident that every wage raise, with its whole momentum, must affect the prices of the products, and that the social gains of each group fully correspond to the social losses of the other groups. Every strike becomes, even in the short run and not only in the long run, a strike against the rest of the people.
Mises says that strikes and other union-privileged activities also trigger other boomerang effects, such as unemployment. Mises believes that the unnatural power of unions was one of the causes of the Great Depression.
In the boom period that ended in 1929, labor unions had succeeded in almost all countries in enforcing wage rates higher than those which the market would have determined. These wage rates already produced in many countries unemployment of a considerable amount, while credit expansion was still going on at an accelerated pace. When finally the inescapable depression came and commodity prices began to drop, the labor unions, firmly supported by the governments, even by those disparaged as anti-labor, clung stubbornly to their high wages policy. They either flatly denied permission for any cut or conceded only insufficient cuts. The result was a tremendous increase in unemployment. The burden of unemployment doles became unbearable. The millions of unemployed were a serious menace to domestic peace. The industrial countries were haunted by the spectre of revolution. But union leaders were intractable, and no statesman had the courage to challenge them openly.
In this situation, Mises describes how government leaders found the answer in fiscal and monetary manipulation.
In this plight, the frightened rulers bethought themselves of a makeshift long since recommended by inflationist doctrinaires. As unions objected to an adjustment of wages to the state of the money relation and commodity prices, They chose to adjust the money relation and commodity prices to the height of wage rates. As they saw it, it was not wage rates that were too high. Their own nation's monetary unit was overvalued in terms of gold and foreign exchange and had to be readjusted. Devaluation was the panacea.
The objectives for devaluing the currency were fivefold, says Mises. Among other things, these objectives would allow nominal wages and prices to increase, so laborers or sellers would have more money. But the value of these wages or prices would sink because of the devaluation, and in this way real wages would decline.
First, to preserve the height of nominal wage rates, or even to create the conditions required for their further increase, while real wages should rather sink. Second, to make commodity prices, especially the prices of farm products, rise in terms of domestic money, or at least to check their further drop. Third, to favor the debtors at the expense of the creditors. Fourth, to encourage exports and to reduce imports. And fifth, to attract more foreign tourists and to make it more expensive in terms of domestic money for the country's own citizens to visit foreign countries.
Such objectives are confused and contradictory, Mises believes. To justify a devaluation, some governments promise farmers and the processing industries that devaluation will make prices rise. At the same time, they promise consumers that price controls will prevent any increase in the cost of living. The problems with such claims and doctrines became at least somewhat apparent when the stock market crash of 1929 was followed by the worldwide Great Depression. But along came John Maynard Keynes and the Keynesian Revolution. Mises says Keynes's teachings were even more contradictory and inconsistent than those of men dismissed as monetary cranks. But he said that Keynes knew how to cloak the plea for inflation and credit expansion in the sophisticated terminology of mathematical economics. Keynes's influence was such that America's President Richard Nixon, widely regarded as a conservative, was to declare several decades after publication of Keynes's general theory, "I, too, am a Keynesian." Mises, however, critiqued some of this kind of official thinking during the Great Depression.
We may admit that for the British and American governments in the 30s, no way was left other than that of currency devaluation, inflation and credit expansion, unbalanced budgets, and deficit spending. Governments cannot free themselves from the pressure of public opinion. They cannot rebel against the preponderance of generally accepted ideologies, however fallacious. But this does not excuse the office holders who could resign rather than carry out policies disastrous for the country. Still less does it excuse authors who try to provide a would-be scientific justification for the crudest of all popular fallacies, inflationism.
Inflation is ages old. It played a crucial role in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Emperor Diocletian's edict of 301 AD attempted to fix wages and prices. Yet historians believe this only exacerbated the breakdown of the Roman coin, the denarius, and hastened the fall of the entire Roman monetary and economic system. Following this collapse was the period known as the Dark Ages. Mises comments in his book Human Action on the collapse of the Roman Empire.
The marvelous civilization of antiquity perished because it did not adjust its moral code and its legal system to the requirements of the market economy. A social order is doomed if the actions which its normal functioning requires are rejected by the standards of morality, are declared illegal by the laws of the country, and are prosecuted as criminal by the courts and the police. The Roman Empire crumbled to dust because it lacked the spirit of liberalism and free enterprise. The policy of interventionism and its political corollary, the Führer principle, decompose the mighty empire, as they will by necessity always disintegrate and destroy any social entity.
Despite the ominous character of passages such as these, Mises was at heart an optimist as well as a realist. Trends can change, he tells us. In the end, the quality of thought is decisive.
Historical trends do not necessarily go on forever. Almost all prognostications which our government statisticians made on the basis of their study of the figures available, which necessarily always refer to the past, have proved faulty. What is called extrapolation or trend lines is viewed by sound statistical theory with the utmost suspicion.
Perhaps there is no better modern example of the reversal of trends than in the change in warfare over the last 3 centuries. Mises cites the long-lost trend of the 18th century, where the severity and horrors of war had been reduced. This trend was sharply reversed in this 20th century of holocausts and terrorism.
In 1770, the Comte de Guibert could write, "Today the whole of Europe is civilized. Wars have become less cruel. Except in combat, no blood is shed. Prisoners are respected. Towns are no longer destroyed. The country is no more ravaged."
Ludwig von Mises died in 1973 at his home in New York City. He did not live to see the revival of his school of Austrian economics. His student and colleague in Vienna, Friedrich Hayek, would win the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, just 1 year after Mises' death. In the long night of his life, Mises could only hold aloft the flag of liberty and ring in the truth as he saw it. In Human Action and his other works, Mises saw economics as an essential yet subordinate part of the human endeavor.
The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics. They will stamp out society and the human race.
Mises gloried in what he regarded as man's greatest gift, reason. He urged students in his famous seminars to read, observe, analyze, and think. Mises himself observed that the market society was the greatest of human achievements.
The truth is that capitalism has not only multiplied population figures, but at the same time improved the people's standard of living in an unprecedented way. Neither economic thinking nor historical experience suggests that any other social system could be as beneficial to the masses as capitalism. The results speak for themselves. The market economy needs no apologists and propagandists. It can apply to itself the words of Sir Christopher Wren's epitaph in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Si monumentum requiris, circumspice. If you seek his monument, look around.
Friedrich Hayek is known as a famous defender of liberty, limited government, and free enterprise. Yet he wrote an essay entitled Why I Am Not a Conservative, saying that conservatives have already accepted too large a part of the collectivist creed. Hayek has sought a principled system of beliefs, rejecting arguments about what is politically possible. and he has been cautious about putting too great a faith in what Adam Smith called that insidious and crafty animal, vulgarly called a statesman or politician.
The task of the political philosopher can only be to influence public opinion, not to organize people for action. He will do so effectively only if he is not concerned with what is now politically possible, but consistently defends the general principles which are always the same. In this sense, I doubt whether there can be such a thing as a conservative political philosophy. Conservatism may often be a useful practical maxim, but it does not give us any guiding principles which can influence long-range developments.
Friedrich August von Hayek was the 1974 Nobel laureate in economics. He has been known for his trenchant analysis of the business cycle. He wrote a widely known political classic published during World War II entitled The Road to Serfdom. Another classic from Hayek on human freedom was published in 1960 entitled The Constitution of Liberty. Hayek's work has made important contributions, not only in such economic subjects as capital, money, and the business cycle, but in fields not ordinarily associated with economics, fields like law, history, science, legislation, and government. In addition to his work on the nature of the business cycle, Hayek is best known for his work on two fundamental ideas: the limitations of knowledge and the way that moral and economic systems are spontaneously formed. At a meeting celebrating Hayek's 85th birthday in 1984, for example, Glenn Campbell, president of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, referred to The Road to Serfdom and noted Hayek's personal courage.
We salute him for a lifetime of wide-ranging intellectual creativity, as well as for his personal courage, integrity, and independence. All these qualities were displayed conspicuously 40 years ago, when Professor Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. At a time when socialism was dominant in Western and especially European intellectual circles, he identified the role that the socialists in Germany had played in paving the way for Adolf Hitler's National Socialism. And he warned incisively and eloquently that democratic socialism could not guarantee the preservation of individual liberty or limited government, because men entrusted with power would be tempted to exceed the constitutional restraints placed upon their exercise of authority. In effect, Professor Hayek warned the West about the perils of 1984 several years before George Orwell did.
Another admirer, the conservative journalist William F. Buckley, Jr., spoke at a 1975 meeting about Hayek's many accomplishments, noting that the very things that Hayek has worked against were and are all around us.
I shall not soon forget the scene, symbolic of the triumphs of demagogic terror over productive enterprise. Senator Scoop Jackson sitting high in his committee chair, addressing the 12 top officials of the oil and gas industry meekly astride their stools at the Bar of Justice, publicly chastising them on their obscene profits. How bracing it would have been if, as one man, they had risen to their feet early in the tirade and walked out, leaving the senator lecturing only to the television cameras, which, of course, he was primarily addressing. Cecil B. DeMille gave up $1 million contract because he refused to pay the sum of $1 to a labor union with a closed shop. Cecil B. DeMille is dead, and all the mighty work of Hayek and Mises and Friedman have not bred his replacement.
Still another observer of Hayek's moral courage is another Nobel laureate and economist, Milton Friedman.
Over the years, I have again and again asked fellow believers in a free society how they managed to escape the contagion of their collectivist intellectual environment. No name has been mentioned more often as the source of enlightenment and understanding than Friedrich Hayek's. I cannot say that for myself, since I was influenced in this direction by my teachers at the University of Chicago, before I had come to know Hayek or his work. but I, like the others, owe him a great debt. From the time I first read some of his works, and even more from the time in the mid-1940s that I first met Friedrich Hayek. His powerful mind, his moral courage, his lucid and always principled exposition have helped to broaden and deepen my understanding of the meaning and the requisites of a free society.
Courage, of course, is not Friedrich Hayek's only attribute. Like his teacher and colleague Ludwig von Mises, Hayek has been a fighter for freedom. Insights on his far-reaching intellectual work are seen in the official announcement of his 1974 Nobel Prize in Economics, presented by the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences.
Von Hayek's contributions in the field of economic theory are both profound and original. His scientific books and articles in the 20s and 30s aroused widespread and lively debate. Particularly, his theory of business cycles and his conception of the effects of monetary and credit policies attracted attention and evoked animated discussion. He tried to penetrate more deeply into the business cycle mechanism than was usual at the time.
The Swedish Academy emphasized Hayek's work in evaluating various economic systems.
The Academy is of the opinion that von Hayek's analysis of the functional efficiency of different economic systems is one of his most significant contributions to economic research in the broadest sense. He presented new ideas with regard to basic difficulties in socialist planning and investigated the possibilities of achieving effective results through decentralized market socialism in various forms.
The Swedish Academy of Sciences also recognized Hayek's major contribution to understanding the nature of social knowledge and how it affects the efficacy of different economic systems.
His guiding principle when comparing various systems was to study how efficiently all the knowledge and information dispersed among individuals and enterprises is utilized. He concluded that only through far-reaching decentralization in a market system with competition and free prices would it be possible to make full use of knowledge and information.
Friedrich August von Hayek, the successor to Mises as the leader of the modern Austrian School of Economics, was born in Vienna on May 8, 1899. His family had a strong academic tradition. One grandfather taught zoology at the University of Vienna, and the other grandfather was a professor of public law at the University of Innsbruck. Hayek's father was a physician and taught plant geography at the University of Vienna, and one of Hayek's younger brothers became professor of anatomy there. Another younger brother became professor of chemistry at the University of Innsbruck. After serving on the Italian front during World War I, Hayek enrolled in the University of Vienna to study law. There he attended lectures of Friedrich von Wieser, who, with Eugene von Böhm-Bawerk, was one of two leading economists of the Austrian School of Economics. Interestingly, during the cold winter of 1919 to 1920, the University of Vienna had to be closed for lack of heating fuel. Hayek spent these months in Zurich. In Zurich, Hayek came across Moritz Schlick's book, General Theory of Knowledge, a work which was to have quite an influence on Hayek's later thinking on the subtleties of knowledge. Back in Vienna, Hayek received in 1921 a doctorate in jurisprudence, and in 1923 a doctorate in political science. Meanwhile, Hayek took a job with an Austrian government office that was created to settle pre-war debts. One of the directors of the office was Ludwig von Mises, and thus began a long and most fruitful intellectual relationship. Hayek soon joined the Mises Private Seminar at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, attended by other intellectual luminaries-to-be, such as Gottfried Haberler, Fritz Machlup, Oscar Morgenstern, and Eric Voegelin. In 1927, after a one-year research assignment at New York University, Hayek, together with Ludwig von Mises, founded the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. Under Hayek's directorship, The research publications of the Austrian Institute reflected their theories that the investment cycle of boom and bust is caused by government's manipulation of money and credit. Indeed, in February 1929, months ahead of the October panic, Hayek predicted in an Institute publication that a financial crisis was about to occur in the United States. Hayek's reputation was growing. In 1931, Professor Lionel Robbins of the London School of Economics invited Hayek to give 4 lectures on the topic of prices and production. This lecture series led to Hayek's book of the same title, to a professorship at the London School, and to a continuing popular concern over the nature and causes of the business cycle. These lectures also initiated a deep and stimulating association with Professor Robbins, and this led to Hayek's 18-year residency in England. In England, Hayek became one of the very few intellectual opponents of John Maynard Keynes. In 1941, the London School, then domiciled in Cambridge because of the bombing of London, granted Hayek a doctorate in economics. Hayek's most famous work, entitled The Road to Serfdom, appeared in 1944. This book was to make Hayek an international celebrity, thanks in part to a condensation of the book in the Reader's Digest. The Road to Serfdom was a bestseller in the immediate post-war years, and it was translated into 16 languages. Hayek dedicated this work to the socialists of all parties, and served up a warning that liberty and the state are naturally opposed to one another. He wrote that totalitarianism not only lurks behind socialism, communism, and fascism, but that totalitarianism also lurks behind democratic socialism and the welfare state. In this book, Hayek says that totalitarianism can develop in relatively free countries, and that vast concentrations of state power are to be avoided. Liberty, ever in a delicate, if not precarious condition, hangs in the balance. In Hayek's view, the design or constitution of the state is crucial. Hayek's student, Dr. Shirley Letwin, has commented on his concern with the design of the government.
One of Hayek's greatest contributions to the defense of freedom is his repeated assertion that belief in the free market and competition, far from absolving us of having to think about legal arrangements, obliges us to do so more carefully. The art of making social arrangements that Hayek would recover for us consists in attending with meticulous deliberation to some things, while letting others arrange themselves.
Still working in London, Hayek in 1947 sought out kindred intellectual souls and arranged a meeting in a hotel atop Mont Pelerin near Vevey, Switzerland. Some 40 economists, political scientists, and journalists met to exchange ideas on a free society. Thus was born the freedom-oriented Mont Pelerin Society, which grew to hundreds of distinguished members drawn from across the world. Among those members have been Chancellor Ludwig Erhard of West Germany, President Luigi Einaudi of Italy, and Prime Minister Pedro Beltran of Peru. Other members of the Mont Pelerin Society have included Ludwig von Mises and 4 Nobel laureates in economics, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, James Buchanan, and, of course, Hayek himself. Milton Friedman comments,
Like many others, I too owe a great debt to Hayek for the role he played in establishing the Mont Pelerin Society. I was fortunate to be in at the birth, at the founding meeting held in 1947 at Mont Pelerin, Switzerland. It was a great occasion, the bringing together on that mountaintop of a goodly company from all the world, differing in many details, but all aware of the threat to freedom, and all determined to do what they could, as intellectuals and citizens, to stem and reverse the tide.
The Mont Pelerin Society, under the presidency of Hayek, adopted a statement of aims on April 8, 1947. Hayek's influence and concerns are apparent in this document. The group stated that it does not aspire to conduct propaganda, that it seeks no orthodoxy, that it aligns itself with no particular party, that it encourages no publicity, that its mission is to strengthen its own thinking. But the statement also says that great issues are at stake in this endeavor.
The central values of civilization are in danger. Over large stretches of the earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared. In others, they are under constant menace from the development of current tendencies of policy. Believing that what is essentially an ideological movement must be met by intellectual argument and the reassertion of valid ideas, the group is of the opinion that further study is desirable in regard to the following 6 lines of inquiry. 1. The analysis and exploration of the nature of the present crisis so as to bring home to others its essential moral and economic origins. 2. The redefinition of the functions of the state so as to distinguish more clearly between the totalitarian and the liberal order. 3. Methods of reestablishing the rule of law and of assuring its development in such manner that individuals and groups are not in a position to encroach upon the freedom of others, and private rights are not allowed to become a basis of predatory power. 4. The possibility of establishing minimum standards by means not inimical to initiative and the functioning of the market. 5. Methods of combating the misuse of history for the furtherance of creeds hostile to liberty. And 6. The problem of the creation of an international order conducive to the safeguarding of peace and liberty, and permitting the establishment of harmonious international economic relations.
In 1950, Hayek accepted a professorship in social and moral sciences at the University of Chicago. There he remained for 12 years in the company of such famous Chicago school figures as Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Frank Knight, Ronald Coase, and Aaron Director. During the Chicago period, Hayek edited a volume of essays entitled Capitalism and the Historians. These essays attacked the idea that the rise of capitalism had eroded the standard of living of the working classes. To Hayek, this was a pure myth. Arthur Shenfield, British economist and barrister, comments,
These essays painstakingly refute the errors of the novelists, journalists, and biased or inferior historians who propagated the widespread belief that early capitalism ground the worker down into misery. That the belief dies hard shows how powerful a grip myth of this kind can acquire on the public mind.
While at Chicago, Hayek published in 1960 a major opus entitled The Constitution of Liberty. In this book, Hayek describes the political and cultural environment that can create and maintain a free society. Hayek also describes what he calls a spontaneous economic order, the idea that no one individual can understand the full interplay of knowledge in the market or society. The idea transcends economics and gets to the philosophy of freedom, as Hayek makes clear at the outset of the book.
In recent years, valiant efforts have been made to clear away the confusions which have long prevailed regarding the principles of the economic policy of a free society. I do not wish to underrate the clarification that has been achieved. Yet though I still regard myself as mainly an economist, I have come to feel more and more that the answers to many of the pressing social questions of our time are to be found ultimately in the recognition of principles that lie outside the scope of technical economics or of any other single discipline. Though it was from an original concern with problems of economic policy that I started, I have been slowly led to the ambitious and perhaps presumptuous task of approaching them through a comprehensive restatement of the basic principles of a philosophy of freedom.
Hayek's drift away from pure economics continued. He published the first of 3 volumes entitled Law, Legislation, and Liberty in 1973. Hayek tells us in the introduction of his first volume that he is concerned about the breakdown of the concept of limited government.
When Montesquieu and the framers of the American Constitution articulated the conception of a limiting constitution that had grown up in England, they set a pattern which liberal constitutionalism has followed ever since. Their chief aim was to provide institutional safeguards of individual freedom, and the device in which they placed their faith was the separation of powers. But governments everywhere have obtained by constitutional means powers which those men meant to deny them. So, this attempt to secure individual liberty by constitutions has evidently failed.
Why have constitutions failed to protect individual liberty? According to Hayek, governments with constitutionally limited powers have given way to the concept of unlimited, unrestrained democracy.
The interpretation given to the traditional formulas of constitutionalism has made it possible to reconcile these with a conception of democracy according to which this is a form of government where the will of the majority on any particular matter is unlimited. As a result, it has already been seriously suggested that constitutions are an antiquated survival which have no place in the modern conception of government.
In 1975, Hayek got back to more customary economic concerns when he readdressed the problem of the business cycle. This problem had become timely when inflation and a severe business downturn occurred in the early 1970s. In 1977, he put forth his radical proposal for denationalizing money. He had hinted at this idea in the book The Constitution of Liberty. Hayek believes that inflation, with its cyclical repercussions, can only be eradicated if the monopoly power of issuing money is removed from the government. That is, from the central banks, such as the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve System in the U.S. This power to issue money would be handed over to the market. This would permit private financial competitors, such as banks, to issue currencies. We would then have a variety of currencies competing with one another for use in the marketplace. Competition between issuers of money, says Hayek, will tend to produce sound money. It will reduce, if not eradicate, inflation. Choice and greater monetary predictability would thereby be restored to money seekers and money holders. We would then see, says Hayek, Gresham's law turned around, with good money driving out bad, rather than bad money driving out good. Like Mises, Hayek subscribes to a monetary theory of the business cycle. In particular, Hayek says that the business cycle is caused by the artificial expansion of bank credit. In this view, credit expansion is initially pleasant. It induces a euphoric boom. This boom, however, induces inflation and inevitably collapses into recession. The process is deceptive, as Hayek described in 1929, the year that the Great Depression began.
Once the process of expansion has become general, the banks soon realize that, for the moment at any rate, they can safely modify their ideas of liquidity. While expansion by a single bank will soon confront it with a clearinghouse deficit of practically the same magnitude of the original new credit, a general expansion carried on at about the same rate by all banks will give rise to clearinghouse claims which, although larger, mainly compensate one another.
But surely the central bank in the U.S., the Federal Reserve, will step in to allay the grim process. Writing in June 1932, or just about 10 years before the Great Depression finally dissipated in the United States, Hayek commented,
"If deflation is not a cause, but an effect of the unprofitableness of industry, then it is surely vain to hope that by reversing the deflationary process we can regain prosperity. Far from following a deflationary policy, central banks, particularly in the United States, have been making earlier and more far-reaching efforts than have been undertaken before to combat the depression by a policy of credit expansion, with the result that the depression has lasted longer and has become more severe than any preceding one.
Hayek explains how, in his view, the recession of 1929 became, in fact, the Great Depression of the 1930s. It lasted not 1 or a few years, but 12 years in the U.S., from 1929 through 1941. Here again is the prescient Professor Hayek declaring in 1932,
"To combat the depression by a forced credit expansion is to attempt to cure the evil by the very means which brought it about. Because we are suffering from a misdirection of production, we want to create further misdirection, a procedure which can only lead to a much more severe crisis as soon as the credit expansion comes to an end."
At this juncture, Hayek turns his attention to people he calls the stabilizers, economic policy makers who seek to counteract deflationary downturns in the economy with renewed fiscal or monetary stimulus. Writing in 1932, Hayek argues that the influence of the so-called stabilizers should be overthrown.
We must not forget that for the last 6 or 8 years, monetary policy all over the world has followed the advice of the stabilizers. It is high time that their influence, which has already done harm enough, should be overthrown. We cannot hope for the overthrow of this alluringly simple theory until its theoretical basis is definitely refuted and something better substituted for it. We really know very little of the forces which we are trying to influence by deliberate management. So little, indeed, that it must remain an open question whether we would try if we knew more.
Hayek echoed these sentiments over 40 years later, in 1975. The world economy had just undergone another boom and bust. The world intelligentsia had not been listening to Mises and Hayek. They had listened to Lord Keynes and his doctrine that full employment can be achieved through demand management. But by 1975, Keynes was in disrepute, and Hayek complains that people ask him how to correct a problem he had warned against.
I find myself in an unpleasant situation. I had preached for 40 years that the time to prevent the coming of a depression is the boom. During their boom, nobody listened to me. Now people again turn to me and ask how the consequences of a policy of which I had constantly warned can be avoided. I must witness the heads of the governments of all the Western industrial countries promising their people that they will stop the inflation and preserve full employment. But I know that they cannot do this. I even fear that such attempts, as President Ford has just announced, to postpone the inevitable crisis by a new inflationary push, may temporarily succeed and make the eventual breakdown even worse.
Hayek proposes 3 hard policy choices in dilemmas of this sort, and he opts for the third.
First, to allow a rapidly accelerating open inflation to continue until it has brought about a complete disorganization of all economic activity. Secondly, to impose wage and price controls, which will, for a time, conceal the effects of a continued inflation, but would inevitably lead to a centrally directed totalitarian system, And thirdly, to terminate resolutely the increase of the quantity of money, which would soon, through the appearance of substantial unemployment, make manifest all the misdirection of labor which the inflation of the past years has caused, and which the two other procedures would further increase.
Hayek said in 1975 that Keynes had burdened the world with what Hayek called the fatal idea that unemployment occurs because aggregate demand is not sufficient. Government spending and credit expansion are recommended by Keynesians as ways to stabilize or increase aggregate demand. Hayek shows that the problem with this idea is in part that infusions of money and credit do not flow over the economy evenly. They upset the intrinsic pricing conditions that should work to adjust the production and consumption of goods. Thus, money infusion and credit expansion contribute to a misdirected investment of capital, and this is the ultimate cause of recession. Here Hayek, though he is no fan of the pessimistic English economist Thomas Malthus, holds that Malthus had understood this central point of Austrian thinking. Hayek liked to cite Malthus from an article in the Edinburgh Review in 1811.
The question of how far and in what manner an increase of currency tends to increase capital appears to us so very important as fully to warrant our attempt to explain it. It is not the quantity of the circulating medium which produces the effects here described, but the different distribution of it. On every fresh issue of notes, a larger proportion falls into the hands of those who consume and produce, and a smaller proportion into the hands of those who only consume.
Let's turn our attention now to Hayek's 1944 classic, The Road to Serfdom. He begins this book with an interesting quotation from David Hume, who said, "It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once." Hume and Hayek would agree that while government is most necessary for sustaining society, liberty still remains not only precious but ephemeral. Liberty is susceptible to serious erosion through the state's interventions, however subtle and gradual some of them may be. This thesis, in other words, is that intervention breeds intervention. With increasing intervention, the market system breaks down. Bureaucracy thrives. The state swells. The individual shrinks. And freedom goes. From this view, it follows that despots like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini are not villains who appear out of nowhere. Rather, in the Hume-Hayek view, this type of man is the natural outgrowth of bad government policies. Those policies and their repercussions eventually and inevitably elicit evil men. Hayek warns that it can happen anywhere, and it can happen again.
The supreme tragedy is still not seen, that in Germany it was largely people of goodwill, men who were admired and held up as models in the democratic countries, who prepared the way for, if they did not actually create, the forces which now stand for everything they detest.
Where does this situation leave us? How should we act?
Yet our chance of averting a similar fate depends on our facing the danger, and on our being prepared to revise even our most cherished hopes and ambitions, if they should prove to be the source of the danger. There are few signs yet that we have the intellectual courage to admit to ourselves that we may have been wrong. Few are ready to recognize that the rise of fascism and Nazism was not a reaction against the socialist trends of the preceding period, but a necessary outcome of those tendencies.
Yet some may rebut Hayek and say that in Western democracies majority rule will prevent things from getting out of hand. This opposing view suggests that if we try socialism, it will be a revocable, rescindable type of democratic socialism. Hayek puts down that line of argument. He contends that socialism talks of freedom, only in the end to deny it. He enlists Alexis de Tocqueville, noting that nobody saw more clearly than de Tocqueville that democracy is an essentially individualist institution, and that it stands in irreconcilable conflict with socialism.
Democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude.
It is in this light that a remarkable chapter in The Road to Serfdom is entitled, Why the Worst Get on Top. This chapter is prefaced with the famous axiom of Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The chapter includes a reference to the perceptive title of a book by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, entitled Moral Man and Immoral Society. This title refers to the idea that man can't really escape himself inside a crowd or a mob, however he tries. He must live with his conscience. Society, on the other hand, is amorphous, ill-defined, fickle, rarely of one opinion, and hence more susceptible to amorality or immorality. So in this chapter, entitled Why the Worst Get on Top, Hayek says that good men are repelled by unlimited power, while bad men are attracted to it. In his view, democratic or liberal socialism becomes in practice a contradiction in terms.
One of the inherent contradictions of the collectivist philosophy is that, while basing itself on the humanistic morals which individualism has developed, it is practicable only within a relatively small group. That socialism, so long as it remains theoretical, is internationalist, while as soon as it is put into practice, whether in Russia or in Germany, it becomes violently nationalist, is one of the reasons why liberal socialism, as most people in the Western world imagine it, is purely theoretical, while the practice of socialism is everywhere totalitarian. Collectivism has no room for the wide humanitarianism of liberalism, but only for the narrow particularism of the totalitarian.
Hayek further condemns those who push for a planned society. He raises the very planning question raised by Lenin. Who plans whom?
Who plans whom? Who directs and dominates whom? Who assigns to other people their station in life? And who is to have his due allotted by others? These become necessarily the central issues to be decided by the supreme power. More recently, an American student of politics has enlarged on Lenin's phrase and asserted that the problem of all government is who gets what, when, and how.
Surprisingly, Hayek concedes that government has the responsibility of determining who gets what, when, and how. But the solution to this critical problem all depends on how those questions are to be answered. It depends on how government is perceived and designed. Is government to be limited, as by a constitution, or is it to be unlimited, and perhaps even totalitarian?
It is the extent of the activities of the government which decides whether everything that any person gets any time depends on the government, or whether its influence is confined to whether some people will get some things in some way, at some time. Here lies the whole difference between a free and a totalitarian system.
Thus, Nazis and socialists complain of the artificial separations of economics and politics, notes Hayek, and they demand the dominance of politics over economics. In this light, Hayek condemns the remarks of Professor H.J. Lasky, a key British Labour Party theoretician in the era of World War II. Lasky told the party's 41st annual conference in London in 1942 that it was time to rid Britain of what he called this mad competitive system which spells poverty for all peoples, and war as an outcome of that poverty. Hayek counsels us to be wary of these so-called totalitarians in our midst, who Hayek says will lead us down the road to serfdom. Hayek also clarifies the sensitive nature of freedom and quotes the English philosopher Hilaire Belloc. The control of the production of wealth is the control of human life itself. Hayek is not so overtly harsh on John Maynard Keynes as he is on others. Keynes, after all, was a friend. In addition, Keynes was a skillful debater, a learned intellectual adversary, and a man of powerful and worldwide influence. Surprisingly, in a letter to Hayek, Keynes thought well of the road to serfdom, as Hayek recalls.
No wonder Keynes' disciples were shocked when, long after his death, it became known that he had, in a private letter, said of my book, The Road to Serfdom, that morally and philosophically he found himself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and not only in agreement, but in deeply moved agreement.
But Keynes the friend was still Keynes the relativist. Thus, at the end of Keynes's life, when Keynes wrote that letter to Hayek, he significantly limited his endorsement of the basic message in the book. Hayek tells us of Keynes' position on the matter.
He qualified this approval by the curious belief that dangerous acts can be done safely in a country which thinks rightly, which could be the way to hell if they were executed by those who feel wrongly.
Hayek's lifelong message was one of limited government, and Keynes's level of disagreement with this message was clarified when Hayek was quoted by Keynes in a 1933 article in the New Statesman magazine. In this article, entitled National Self-Sufficiency, Keynes proclaimed that capitalism is despicable.
The decadent international but individualistic capitalism, in the hands of which we found ourselves after the war, is not a success. It is not intelligent. It is not beautiful, it is not just, it is not virtuous, and it does not deliver the goods. In short, we dislike it and are beginning to despise it.
Hayek found this passage to be most revealing. Of course, Keynes's sense that capitalism is despicable was influenced by the Great Depression. This depression helped shape Keynes's monumental analysis of the business cycle in his major opus entitled The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936. In 1983, Hayek was asked by the London Economist for an evaluation of Keynesianism on the occasion of the Keynes centenary. Hayek used the occasion to present the Austrian view of the business cycle and to criticize Keynes's macroeconomic view that government should allocate resources by managing aggregate demand.
This constant reallocation of resources is wholly concealed by the analysis Keynes chose to adopt, and which has since come to be known as macroeconomics, an analysis in terms of the relations between various aggregates or averages, such as aggregate demand or supply, average prices, etc. This approach obscures the character of the mechanism by which the demand for the different kinds of activities is determined.
Macroeconomics also raises the question of how aggregate phenomena are measured, and it raises statistical problems like data accuracy and data lags. Of course, statistics reflect only the past, never the future. Statisticians can anticipate the future only by measuring and applying data from the past. So Hayek raises the question of just how accurate and meaningful aggregate measurements can be in the effort to control the business cycle. To this question, Hayek, of course, brings to bear his perception of knowledge. Recall the title of his Nobel lecture in 1974, The Pretense of Knowledge. As Hayek commented in the London Economist in 1983,
The hope of becoming more empirical by becoming more macroeconomic is bound to be disappointed, because these statistical magnitudes which are alone ascertainable by measurement do not also make them significant as the cause of actions of individuals who do not know them. Economic phenomena are not mass phenomena of the kind to which statistical theory is applicable. They belong to that intermediate sphere that lies between the simple phenomena, of which people can ascertain all the relevant data, and the true mass phenomena, where one must rely on probabilities.
Accordingly, Hayek sees Keynes not only as a supreme macroeconomist, but as an inadvertent destabilizer and inflationist. Hayek said that Keynesian theories are chiefly responsible for the inflation of the past quarter of a century. But Hayek reminds us, ironically, that the young anti-inflationist Keynes had written himself in 1919,
There is no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a way which not one man in a million is able to diagnose.
Still, Hayek concedes the brilliance of his intellectual adversary while writing him off as a disaster.
Keynes, who was the most impressive intellectual figure I have ever encountered, and whose general intellectual superiority I have readily acknowledged, was wholly wrong in the scientific work for which he is chiefly known. Indeed, I am convinced that through his denial of conventional morals and his haughty "in the long run we are all dead" approach, his influence was disastrous.
Hayek wrote an essay entitled Individualism, True and False, in which he said that this Keynesian idea, this idea that in the long run we are all dead, springs from a false individualism. In Hayek's view, Keynes's individualism was an unprincipled, if not an immoral, individualism. Keynes himself described at one time his particular individualism as it manifested itself in his elitist Bloomsbury Set, a rather effete literary group in London in the early 20th century.
We repudiated entirely customary morals, conventions, and traditional wisdom. We were, that is to say, in the strict sense of the term, immoralists. The consequences of being found out had, of course, to be considered for what they were worth. But we recognized no moral obligation on us, no inner sanction to conform or to obey. Before heaven, we claimed to be our own judge in our own case.
This false individualism, as Hayek puts it, stands in contrast to the philosophy of Edmund Burke. Hayek much admired Burke's statement of his moral philosophy.
Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their appetites, in proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their own soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good, in preference to the flattery of the knaves.
Hayek's dichotomous career as half economist, half philosopher cast light on his deep interest in the nature of knowledge. In his lecture entitled The Pretense of Knowledge, given when he accepted the Nobel Prize, Hayek concedes the broad failure of his profession of economist. Hayek suggests two reasons for that failure: knowledge and environment.
We have indeed, at the moment, little cause for pride. As a profession, we have made a mess of things. It seems to me that this failure of economists to guide policy more successfully is closely connected with their propensity to imitate, as closely as possible, the procedures of the brilliantly successful physical sciences. An attempt which, in our subject, may lead to outright error.
Knowledge in the social sphere is especially elusive. Man cannot achieve full knowledge in this area, says Hayek at the conclusion of his Nobel lecture. Because man cannot achieve full knowledge in social affairs, Hayek believes that a sensitive political environment must necessarily be oriented to the private sector.
If man is not to do more harm than good in his efforts to improve the social order, he will have to learn that in this, as in all other fields where essential complexity of an organized kind prevails, he cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of events possible. He will therefore have to use what knowledge he can achieve, not to shape the results as the craftsman shapes his handiwork, but rather to cultivate a growth by providing the appropriate environment, as the gardener does for his plants.
This type of thought is a key to understanding the life work of Friedrich Hayek. Note his essential idea that man cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of events possible. George Roach, president of Hillsdale College, has commented on that conclusion in Hayek's Nobel lecture.
Just what is the appropriate environment to which Hayek refers? The depth and breadth of Hayek's scholarship should make clear the interrelation he has discovered between the economic sector and other portions of the social order. We cannot mend the damage of collectivist philosophy merely by discrediting economic interventionism. If we are to be effective in restoration of the free society, we must also address ourselves to the damage the collectivist ideal has done in other areas of men's lives. The working of a free economic order ultimately depends upon the moral and spiritual underpinnings of the free society as a whole.
George Roach accurately reflects Hayek's thinking on moral and spiritual underpinnings. Hayek himself echoed this emphasis on morality when speaking in 1983 at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where he lectured on the constructive constraints that morality places on man.
We must resign ourselves to the fact that our morals do not lead us where we wish to go, that in particular they do not produce beauty, pleasure, or generally guide us to what we want, but rather warn us not to pursue some short ways to what we desire, because to do so would cause damage to the order on which we all count to achieve what is possible.
Hayek says that morals forge civilized man more than civilized man forges morals. Moral evolution cannot be forced. It must be reckoned with. In this sense, man should be humble and realize his limitations, especially when it comes to obtaining social knowledge.
Man has become as intelligent as he is because he did not go where he wished. If he had been allowed to follow his innate emotions or to do what he likes, he would certainly never have achieved the powers which his intellect now confers on him.
Hayek counsels us not to assume we are a race of supermen, and speaks of his book on this subject that was being written in the mid-1980s.
The fatal conceit which is the subject of the book on which I am working, is devoted precisely to refute the erroneous belief that man has made himself, to quote the title of a book by V. Gordon Childe, published in 1936. All of evolution that has increased our power was an adaptation to the as yet unknown. Planned evolution would be the end of evolution itself. Moral evolution, in particular, does not and cannot move in the direction that man wishes, and if it did follow human direction, would soon cease to help preserve what it has created. It would mean the pupil teaching the teacher.
Hayek also rejects the notion that human reason and experience alone can form the basis of man's beliefs. In a passage with overtones of religious faith, Hayek says the strict rationalist tends to become a barbarian.
It is my aim today to show how the strict rationalist, who denies the acceptability of all beliefs founded on anything but experience and reasoning, tends to become a barbarian unless he makes concessions to expediency. This is true even if, as he usually does, he puts aesthetic or other kinds of pleasures as the deliberate goals of his efforts.
Hayek wonders if man the all-knowledgeable doesn't become man the omnipotent, and hence man the most dangerous.
I sometimes have the impression that in a world that depends on traditions which the individual cannot rationally justify, some of the most intelligent men can become the most dangerous fools, aliens to and disturbers of the civilization in which they live.
The nature of knowledge is critical. As we have seen, the use of knowledge is a central message of Hayek's life. This message is pinpointed in his article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, in the September 1945 issue of the American Economic Review. He could have just as easily entitled this article, The Misuse of Knowledge in Society. For Hayek, knowledge is often simply presented in the social sphere as a set of givens, as so much data, or as so many paradigms of organization that are never to be questioned. The central planner, for example, typically has at hand those organizational paradigms, along with data and assumptions about how things work. All he then has to do is simply allocate resources. But things are not so simple. As Hayek points out, the use of knowledge is a complex matter. As an example of bungled planning, Hayek's teacher and colleague Ludwig von Mises criticized the planning of American agriculture by the Federal Farm Board. This board began its work in 1929, and Mises called it planned chaos. Hayek reminds us that market knowledge is dispersed knowledge.
The peculiar character of the problem of a rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess.
This peculiar character of knowledge, as Hayek puts it, poses a special problem to society.
The economic problem of society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate given resources, if given is taken to mean given to a single mind, which deliberately solves the problem set by these data. It is rather a problem of how to secure the best use of resources known to any of the members of society, for ends whose relative importance only these individuals know. Or, to put it briefly, it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge which is not given to anyone in its totality.
It may be an enticing idea to some people to grasp for or to believe in such a totality of information and understanding, such a sum of knowledge, but Hayek says it still is a bad idea. The idea is particularly abused by the planner, who blithely assumes such total knowledge and even sometimes passes it off as scientific knowledge. Hayek explains that scientific knowledge is not always scientific, as that word is commonly understood.
Today, it is almost heresy to suggest that scientific knowledge is not the sum of all knowledge. But a little reflection will show that there is, beyond question, a body of very important but unorganized knowledge which cannot possibly be called scientific, in the sense of knowledge of general rules, the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. It is with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all others, because he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made, but of which use can be made only if the decisions depending on it are left to him, or are made with his active cooperation.
Hayek illustrates what he has in mind about the dispersion of social knowledge with some commonplace examples.
We need to remember only how much we have to learn in any occupation after we have completed our theoretical training. How big a part of our working life we spend learning particular jobs, and how valuable an asset in all walks of life is knowledge of people, of local conditions, and of special circumstances. To know of and put to use a machine not fully employed, or somebody's skill which could be better utilized, or to be aware of a surplus stock which can be drawn upon during an interruption of supplies, is socially quite as useful as the knowledge of alternative techniques.
Hayek spells out more obvious economic implications of his thought.
The shipper, who earns his living from using otherwise empty or half-filled journeys of tramp steamers, or the real estate agent, whose whole knowledge is almost exclusively one of temporary opportunities, or the arbitrager, who gains from local differences of commodity prices, are all performing eminently useful functions based on special knowledge of circumstances of the fleeting moment not known to others.
Hayek's critics try to refute his principle that knowledge is dispersed by pointing to the supremacy of technology in the world today. It's a high-tech world. Men have walked on the moon, and highly sophisticated computers can digest vast amounts of data. Hayek is not impressed with the argument. He notes that change is constant and unpredictable, and of course it doesn't affect past data nearly as much as it affects future data.
It is, perhaps worth stressing, economic problems arise always and only in consequence of change. As long as things continue as before, or at least they were expected to, there arise no new problems requiring a decision, no need to form a new plan.
But if change is constant, why don't mainstream economists take it into account? Hayek suggests an answer.
One reason why economists are increasingly apt to forget about the constant small changes which make up the whole economic picture is probably their growing preoccupation with statistical aggregates, which show a very much greater stability than the movements of the detail.
Price indices, such as the monthly Consumer Price Index, are cases in point. Let's assume that food prices advance and energy prices fall, with the index being unchanged in a particular month. Some economists will infer that all prices are stable, when they are really not. Individual prices, of course, are signals. They are bits of vital information to buyers and sellers that cause them to act or not to act. Here Hayek introduces the word marvel to shock his readers out of their complacency about the market price system.
The marvel is that in a case like that of a scarcity of one raw material, without an order being issued, without more than perhaps a handful of people knowing the cause, tens of thousands of people whose identity could not be ascertained by months of investigation are made to use the material or its products more sparingly. That is, they move in the right direction. This is enough of a marvel, even if, in a constantly changing world, not all will hit it off so perfectly that their profit rates will always be maintained at the same even or normal level.
The marvel extends beyond the market and arises in connection with nearly all truly social phenomena, including language and culture. Hayek makes the point that the market shortcuts information channels. It releases the human mind and a person's scarce commodity of time, so he or she can pursue other interests. Hayek favored the words of the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead on this point.
It is a profoundly erroneous truism, repeated by all copybooks and by eminent people when they are making speeches, that we should cultivate the habit of thinking what we are doing. The precise opposite is the case. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them.
The nature of knowledge applies to the economist's understanding of competition, monopoly, and public antitrust policy. It applies to the government's attitudes toward pricing, bigness, cartels, monopoly, oligopoly, mergers and acquisitions, and the like. In a lecture entitled Competition as a Discovery Procedure, delivered to the Philadelphia Society in 1968, Hayek notes that economists are divided on their treatment of monopoly and competition.
It is difficult to defend economists against the charge that for some 40 to 50 years they have been discussing competition on assumptions that, if they were true of the real world, would make it wholly uninteresting and useless. If anyone really knew all about what economic theory calls the data, competition would indeed be a very wasteful method of securing adjustment to these facts. It is thus not surprising that some people have been led to the conclusion that we can either wholly dispense with the market, or that its results should be used only as a first step towards securing an output of goods and services, which we can then manipulate, correct, or redistribute in any manner we wish. Others, who seem to derive their conception of competition solely from modern textbooks, have, not unnaturally, concluded that competition does not exist.
Hayek believes these two positions on the nature of competition do not conform to the real world, again because mainstream economists have an inadequate understanding of the nature of knowledge.
It is salutary to remember that wherever the use of competition can be rationally justified, it is on the ground that we do not know in advance the facts that determine the actions of competitors. In sports or in examinations, no less than in the award of government contracts or of prizes for poetry, it would clearly be pointless to arrange for competition if we were certain beforehand who would do best. As indicated in the title of this lecture, I propose to consider competition as a procedure for the discovery of such facts, as, without resort to it, would not be known to anyone, or at least would not be utilized.
Hayek believes that the failure to understand and appreciate the nature of knowledge, especially in the marketplace, helps explain the failure of mainstream economists to understand and appreciate the true nature of competition. In his view, competition is the very process by which we discover superior economic solutions. These failures of understanding, in turn, may help explain why public antitrust policy in many countries, including the U.S., is often thought to be anti-competitive. IBM, for example, had to engage in some dozen years of expensive litigation, defending itself against a charge by the U.S. Department of Justice that IBM's very size in the computer field was inhibiting competition. Nonetheless, in these same dozen years, Apple created the personal computer, catching giant IBM napping. In the same period, other big computer firms like NCR, Hewlett-Packard, and Digital Equipment seem to have thrived. The IBM lawsuit stimulated many interpretations about what constitutes fair competition in the computer industry. But a great deal of litigation expense and public debate became moot in 1982 when the Justice Department withdrew its charge of anti-competitive behavior against IBM. Since an understanding of competition has important consequences, Hayek says we should consider some of the unrealistic nomenclature used by many economists in discussing competition.
Economists usually describe the order which competition produces as an equilibrium, a somewhat unfortunate term, because such an equilibrium presupposes that the facts have already all been discovered, and competition, therefore, has ceased.
Hayek maintains that such equilibrium never really exists, that life and markets are too dynamic for that. Austrian economists believe that change is always at work, and that markets approach equilibrium but never quite attain it because of the dynamics of change.
The point to keep constantly in mind is that all economic adjustment is made necessary by unforeseen changes. And the whole reason for employing the price mechanism is to tell individuals that what they are doing or can do has, for some reason for which they are not responsible, become less or more demanded. Adaptation of the whole order of activities to changed circumstances rests on the remuneration derived from different activities being changed, without regard to the merits or faults of those affected.
In like manner, Hayek also criticizes the mainstream economists' use of the concept of perfect competition.
Current conceptions of anti-monopoly policy are largely misguided by the application of certain conceptions developed by the theory of perfect competition, which are irrelevant to conditions where the factual presuppositions of the theory of perfect competition are absent. The theory of perfect competition involves the number of buyers and sellers sufficiently large to make it impossible for any one of them deliberately to influence prices. This does not mean, however, that it is desirable everywhere to bring about a state of affairs where large numbers buy and sell a uniform commodity.
A public policy that attempts to create uniform commodities and prices would be meaningless, says Hayek. He notes that there is a widespread misunderstanding of labor competition and monopoly. He says the real monopolistic threat to a free society arises mostly from the special privileges and immunities granted by government. This is especially true with regard to the legal use of compulsion, a monopolistic privilege typically conferred on trade unions in Western democracies like Britain and America.
The monopolistic practices which threaten the functioning of the market are today much more serious on the side of labor than on the side of enterprise. and the preservation of the market order will depend, more than on anything else, on whether we succeed in curbing them.
Hayek makes clear how, in his view, unhealthy developments in the trade union movement tend to force government into policies that are basically unworkable.
The reason for this is that the developments in the labor field are bound to force government, and are already forcing many governments, into two kinds of measures which are wholly destructive of the market order. Attempts authoritatively to determine the appropriate incomes of the various groups by what is called an incomes policy, and efforts to overcome the wage rigidities by an inflationary monetary policy. But since this evasion of the real issue by only temporarily effective monetary means must have the effect that those rigidities will constantly increase, they are a mere palliative, which can only postpone, but not solve, the central problem.
By the same token, Hayek, ever the advocate of human liberty, has little regard for so-called social legislation. He cautions us about how the concept of social justice often leads to welfare interventionism.
This pursuit of social justice made it necessary for governments to treat the citizen and his property as an object of administration, with the aim of securing particular groups. Among the landmarks in this development, which led to the creation of special rules for particular classes, is the English Trade Disputes Act of 1906, which conferred on the labor unions unique privileges. In the same vein were the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court during the New Deal, which conceded to legislatures unlimited powers to safeguard the vital interests of the people, saying, in effect, that for any end a legislature regarded as beneficial, it might pass any law it liked.
What then are the fundamental political rules guiding a free society? Hayek sums it up in three interesting and powerful words, each one of them describing the absence of a corresponding evil.
The basic principles of a liberal society may be summed up by saying that in such a society, all coercive functions of government must be guided by the overruling importance of what I like to call the three great negatives: peace, justice, and liberty.
Hayek's strength of character can be seen in his perception of his fellow economists and of himself. Shirley Letwin, his student during his Chicago days, recalls Hayek saying that it was a joke of his youth that Austrian economists were superior to the German ones because the Austrians had no influence on public policy. She recalls Hayek saying,
I have later observed that same difference between the English and American economists. At least in the 30s, the English economists were undoubtedly the better theoreticians, and at the same time much less involved in the conduct of current policy. This has somewhat changed since, and I am not sure that the effect has been altogether beneficial for the state of scientific economics in England.
About his own work, Hayek comments that his concerns have not been political.
If I have succeeded in building up something like a fairly systematic body of opinion on economic policy, that is not least due to the circumstance that all this time I had to be content with the role of a spectator, and had never asked what was politically possible, or what would assist any group with which I was connected.
Hayek is not advocating an eternal ban against political talk by economists. He is urging us to know the proper relation between abstract understanding and practical decisions. The distinction between them is essential to a free society, as Dr. Shirley Letwin has commented.
An abstract theory cannot be used for deciding political issues without determining what conditions in the real world correspond to the theoretical scheme. And this, Hayek points out, is often more difficult than understanding the theory itself. It requires a skill rather different from the economists', something like a sense for the physiology of events. Therefore, while economic theory can tell us a great deal about the effectiveness of different kinds of economic systems, it has comparatively little to say on the concrete effects of particular measures in given circumstances.
Dr. Letwin lauds Hayek's stand for principle. She comments that this distinction between the abstract and the concrete is not an easy one, that it calls for a delicate balance in the human mind.
Hayek has shown that to remain free, we must keep moving between an abstract understanding of the fundamental postulates of our thought and concrete practical knowledge. And he has required us to rejoice in the difficulties of maintaining such a precarious balance. For it goes with recognizing that a human being is a unique, rational consciousness in a world where nothing stands still. And it is only for beings of this kind that liberty can matter.
Dr. Letwin sums up the problem for us as she sizes up Hayek's character.
In short, Hayek has set lovers of liberty the most difficult of assignments, to think clearly about how to arrange our affairs without supposing that we can get to the root of all things or foresee all consequences. That requires a rare combination of diffidence, courage, and thoughtfulness. But then Hayek provided the model.
Hayek's character is also seen in his acceptance remarks at the banquet given to the Nobel laureates in Stockholm just after the presentation of the prizes. The remarks particularly testify to Hayek's innate modesty and moral integrity.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, now that the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economic Science has been created, one can only be profoundly grateful for having been selected as one of its joint recipients. And the economists certainly have every reason for being grateful to the Swedish Riksbank for regarding their subject as worthy of this high honor.
At this point, though, Hayek makes quite a confession.
Yet I must confess that if I had been consulted whether to establish a Nobel Prize in economics, I should have decidedly advised against it. One reason was that I feared such a prize, as I believed is true of the activities of some of the great scientific foundations, would tend to accentuate the swings of scientific fashion. This apprehension the selection committee has brilliantly refuted by awarding the prize in one whose views are as unfashionable as mine are. I do not yet feel equally reassured concerning my second cause of apprehension. It is that the Nobel Prize confers on an individual an authority which in economics no man ought to possess. This does not matter in the natural sciences. Here the influence exercised by an individual is chiefly an influence on his fellow experts, and they will soon cut him down to size if he exceeds his competence.
Well, what about the economist, the so-called dismal scientist?
But the influence of the economist that mainly matters is an influence over laymen, politicians, journalists, civil servants, and the public generally. There is no reason why a man who has made a distinctive contribution to economic science should be omnicompetent of all problems of society, as the press tends to treat him, till in the end he may himself be persuaded to believe. One is even made to feel it a public duty to pronounce on problems to which one may not have devoted special attention. I am not sure that it is desirable to strengthen the influence of a few individual economists by such a ceremonial and eye-catching recognition of achievements, perhaps of the distant past.
Hayek has expressed his reservations, and now he has a modest proposal that succinctly captures his view of knowledge and of political or economic authority.
I am, therefore, almost inclined to suggest that you require from your laureates an oath of humility, a sort of Hippocratic oath, never to exceed in public pronouncements the limits of their competence. Or you ought at least, on conferring the prize, remind the recipient of the sage counsel of one of the great men in our subject, Alfred Marshall, who wrote, "Students of social science must fear popular approval. Evil is with them when all men speak well of them."
If you enjoyed this discussion, you will probably enjoy other products of the Cato Institute, including tapes of policy forums, monographs, books, and publications. For more information on the Cato Institute, write to Cato Institute, 1000 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20001, or call 202-842-0200. For a catalog of Cato publications, call toll-free 1-800-767-1241, or visit our site on the World Wide Web at http://www.cato.org. We hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute.